Hi everyone, Dan Edmunds here, and this is my very own Toyota 4Runner TRD Off-Road. As you know, I used to tune suspensions for a living, and this particular version of the 4Runner has something going on in the suspension department that caught my eye. So in a moment, I'm going to pull the wheels off, and we're going to have a look, and I'll point out exactly what it was that made me gravitate toward this particular version of the 4Runner. But before I get started, remember to like, subscribe, share with your friends, all the things. Here it is, the front suspension of my Toyota 4Runner. And Toyota fans will recognize it probably because it's very similar to what's underneath the front end of a Toyota Tacoma. And both of them are downsized versions of what's under the Tundra. So this double wishbone layout is pretty common at the front end of a Toyota truck. Like those others, the 4Runner has a high mount upper arm, which puts this ball joint and the arm and its pivot points up high above the action. And the higher up they are, the more leverage there is in the steering knuckle here, and that reduces the stress on all these components. Also, you'll notice there's quite a slope here to the pivot. It's down towards the back, and that is a sign that this is anti-dive geometry to reduce the tendency for severe nosedive when you get on the brakes. The coilover shock here is bolted to the chassis using what Toyota calls performance nuts, and they look unusual because they are actually. They've got this thick bottom here, and there's no threads in the bottom part. The threads are only here where the hex is, and what that does is it moves the center of the bolted joint up away from the surface and makes that clamping area longer, so that when you torque the bolt down, there's more stretch in the bolt and more strength in the joint. Coming down from the top, we can see the coilover shock, and that's what supports the weight of the vehicle. Just to the right is the long steering knuckle that reaches up to the upper ball joint. It's got a curious hole that we'll talk about in a minute. And then down near the bottom, you can see how the shock necks down to a shaft, so it can sneak by the side of the drive axle. The lower control arm is a big Y-shaped steel wishbone with lots of reinforcements. Its inner pivots have big eccentrics that are used to make caster and camber adjustments. Here's the front bump stop, and you can see that this rubber stopper contacts here on this reinforced section of the lower control arm. Little concentric circles help to ease the initial contact so it's a little less abrupt than it might be if it were completely solid. This here is an extension off the lower ball joint housing, and it's a steering stop that's meant to interface with this reinforcement on the lower wishbone. At full right lock, it's full left right now. These two would touch in certain circumstances, and the idea is it's better to have these two pieces touch than have the rack and pinion steering gearbox bind up within itself. But this might be why you might hear a pop at full lock when you're making maneuvers off-road, when the suspension is articulating at the same time. The 4Runner has a really nice, beefy, 4-piston fixed caliper. You can see all 4 pistons right here. And it's got a nice, big, open window, so if I pull this pin and this pin, the pads will come right out. Easy to swap. And then you can see the rotor is nicely ventilated, and it's pretty beefy. It's got a lot of thermal mass. Yeah, these are decent brakes. This hole is empty because this particular TRD Off-Road 4Runner has the KDSS option, which stands for Kinetic Dynamic Suspension System. That sounds really comprehensive, but really it's just an alternate stabilizer bar configuration, which we can see here. If this had a standard stabilizer bar, if it was anything other than a TRD Off-Road, or if it was a TRD Off-Road without KDSS, we'd see a link bolted here and a stabilizer bar mounted a little bit higher, closer to this. So what is KDSS? It's a disconnectable stabilizer bar system. Now, disconnectable, people will argue with me. Disableable is harder to say, but that's kind of what it does. So the stabilizer bar is there when you need it and gone when you don't, and you don't have to push a button. It's completely passive. This cylinder here is the heart of KDSS, but there's just one on the driver's side. The passenger side, which you can see in the dim distance there, is a fixed length rod that holds this pivot point in this position all the time. It looks a little bit like a piston rod if you can see it back there in the distance. But this strut is either held in position at this length that you see right here, so that the stabilizer bar will be held firmly in this point, and then when the vehicle corners, the bar will develop roll stiffness to prevent body roll. Off-road, this is allowed to go limp, and when this goes limp, what happens is the bar just wobbles around in this area instead of developing any roll stiffness. So in an off-road situation, and when this goes limp, it's like the stabilizer bar isn't even there. These are hydraulic lines that are connected to the KDSS cylinder. The cylinder has a piston halfway up its length, and the oil chamber on the upper side of the piston goes to one of these lines, and the oil chamber that's below the piston feeds to the other line. So in that way, if the piston moves up and down, oil will flow in these two lines. And that is part of the reason why KDSS can work. What the presence of KDSS does, when you have disconnectable stabilizer bars, you can put a nice big fat one here. The engineers aren't faced with that trade-off where they're trying to allow articulation, but they have to prevent body lean that makes the passengers uncomfortable. Here, they can have their cake and eat it too, because since this can be disconnected, they can specify a nice big fat one. So this 4Runner has less body roll in corners than a normal 4Runner without KDSS. But it also has better wheel articulation because these can just effectively disappear. And it also has bearing for something like having a rooftop tent or other roof-mounted load. If you have more roll stiffness down here, you can tolerate more load up there. The increase in roll stiffness isn't quite as massive as it looks. I mean, this is a much bigger stabilizer bar than what you'd see on a standard Toyota 4Runner. But the standard Toyota 4Runner mounting here would have a 1-to-1 motion ratio, so its smaller bar would be 100% efficient. This one is bolted midway out on the lower arm at about, looks like 70%. You know, the coil-over shock absorber is more like 60, and this looks like about 70%, maybe 75. So this bigger bar isn't 100% efficient like the standard 4Runner bar is. Still, the difference here is bigger than this liability. Well, that's about it for the front, but I'm going to put this tire and wheel on and move to the back. And as you'll see, they're kind of connected together. Here are those two hydraulic lines coming from the front KDSS cylinder, and they're met behind here by a pair coming from the rear. That's right, KDSS works because there's a front and a rear cylinder. All right, here we are. This is the 4Runner's link coil rear suspension. It's a 5-link in their vernacular, but we can't see all 5 links very easily. The lower link, as you can see, is quite long, and it's in line with the lower frame rail. There's quite a bit to see in this little frame. This silver bolt here is one end of that missing upper link. We saw the prominent lower link. The upper link goes from there, a bracket on the upper reaches of the axle, to a position here on the frame above the gas tank. That's what this is here. It's running behind, as you can see, the coil spring. And the coil spring is interesting too. It's a straight rate, not progressive, but it kind of is, because there's this rubber stopper in the middle that works as an overload spring. So it contacts here, and you can see that it's got a really interesting shape so that it gets more and more effective as it compresses more. But this isn't the bump stop. No, this is the bump stop. So we really have spring, overload spring, and bump stop, so that as you progress into that, it's a gradual transition. It doesn't just bam, hit the bump stop. Here I have removed the spare tire so we can see things better. And the main thing that we can see right here is the rear stabilizer bar. And this is the KDSS cylinder. It's on the driver's side, just like the one up front. It's got a couple of hoses there that run along the frame rail to that comparator we saw midway along the vehicle. And you can see on the passenger side here, the pivot is a fixed steel rod, much like we saw in the front. So when you're cornering and this is held firm, then this point is fixed in space and the stabilizer bar can function and develop roll stiffness. When you're off-road in a mogul situation and this is allowed to move freely, well then this does not generate any roll stiffness. It just kind of wobbles in place back here and doesn't behave like it's there. Now the key to KDSS is that there's one of these at the front and the back, and basically what's going on is the pressures from the two are being compared at the middle of the vehicle. And if you're turning left or right, the pressures are either positive or negative at the same time, and they kind of meet at loggerheads in the middle and no fluid can flow. But if you're in a mogul situation where one of these is compressing and the other is extending, well then the fluid is trying to circulate, and it can freely, and there's no electronics needed to make that happen. I have a way I might be able to illustrate the concept, but I don't know if it's going to work. We'll give it a try. So I've been racking my brains about ways to illustrate how KDSS works, and the best I could come up with on short notice was this beach cruiser. So bear with me because it's not a direct analog, but it's pretty close. So we can imagine these pedals as being the two KDSS struts that are here on the driver's side of the 4Runner, front and rear. And the two pedal arms are the pair of hydraulic lines that run from each of them into a central comparator, which is halfway along the frame rail. So if I'm cornering, left or right, both sides of the vehicles are said to be in phase. In other words, the suspension on both sides is doing the same thing, either compressing or extending. So when you're compressing or extending, the force that's being exerted on the struts is balanced. The fluid can't flow because it basically runs into each other head on and nothing can move. But the same structure, if I go up my ramp or on a mogul situation, moves freely. The fluid just flows from one to the other. Nothing has changed here. It's just that the forces now oppose each other rather than cancel each other out. And that's really the magic of KDSS, because it's totally passive and it's totally hydraulic. I know this is steel, but imagine fluid flowing through tubes not being able to move or being able to move freely. But there's one more thing that KDSS does. When you put big stabilizer bars on, as you can when you have a disconnectable system like KDSS, well, now you've got more roll stiffness, and a lot of roll stiffness can mess up ride comfort when you hit single wheel bumps and you end up with head toss. So what KDSS does is it looks at a steering sensor and the G sensor, and if you're driving straight, a valve will open that will allow the hydraulic pressure that's in these lines and meeting in the middle to go into an accumulator that's gas pressurized and take the edge off and allow it to move somewhat. And then when you get into a cornering situation, the valve closes again, and now that filter isn't there. And of course, through it all, the out-of-phase articulation feature of KDSS that makes it so brilliant still operates. And so that's pretty much it in a nutshell. And that's why I wanted this system on my 4Runner. The other thing we can see back here is this link. This is the Panhard bar, or the track rod. It's bolted here to this bracket on the axle, and the other end there is a big bracket that's coming off the frame itself. So if you can imagine, if the axle tries to move left or right, it can't, because the track bar is holding it steady. Now you can also see that you want your track bar to be as long as you can make it, because then as the vehicle goes up and down, as it swings through its arc, the suspension doesn't translate left and right. I mean, there always will be a little bit, but the longer you can make that track bar or Panhard rod, the less of that you're going to see. As we saw in the front, the rear shocks here are nothing spectacular. These are fairly straightforward shock absorbers. That's why the TRD Off-Road is so much cheaper than the TRD Pro. It's also why I bought it, because I can do whatever I want in the suspension department. I can put in my own springs and shocks. I can do the same up front. I can do it for a lot less money than it costs to get a TRD Pro. Now, I won't have the badge. Back in there, you're looking at another feature that drew me to the TRD Off-Road. That's the differential lock mechanism. It comes on the TRD Off-Road and the TRD Pro, and that's it. So if I get a TRD Off-Road, I get a diff lock, and I can add KDSS, and that's a combination you can't get on any other version of the 4Runner, including the Pro. So these are the rear brakes on the 4Runner, and as you can see, it's a single piston sliding caliper. Here's the piston here, and these are the two pins on which the caliper slides. Inside you can see the edges of a ventilated rotor, so that's nice. It's got this real prominent hat section, and that's because inside here is a second brake. Yeah, there's a drum style parking brake inside here, and that's cable operated. All right, the 4Runner rolls on P265 70R 17 tires, and the wheels are 7.5 inches wide, and together they weigh 71 pounds apiece. I've got some new wheels and tires going on in a little while, so it'll be interesting to see how much this goes up. That about wraps up this close-up look at the suspension of my TRD Off-Road 4Runner, including its brilliant KDSS system. How effective is that at improving articulation off-road? I'll find out soon enough when I put it on my ramp, but I'm not going to do that today because I've got a TRD Pro 4Runner to bring in first, and then I'm going to compare the two of them. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, until next time, this is Dan Edmunds saying thanks for watching.